The village of Fjord lay quiet, nestled beside the cold glinting waters of the Norwegian coast. As the day faded and the long northern twilight settled, a hush fell upon the clustered wooden homes with their thatched roofs, warmed by flickering hearths within. A thin mist rolled in from the sea, hugging the earth like a woolen cloak, and above, the stars began to pierce the deepening blue. Inside a longhouse, the warmth of the fire crackled softly, casting golden light on the wooden walls darkened by smoke and time. The scent of burning pine mixed with the earthy aroma of wool, leather, and dried fish. Tonight, like every night, the village would rest under the watchful eye of its chosen few, the Viking Night Watch. These men were not warriors in the usual sense. They bore axes and wore cloaks, yes, but their task was not battle. They were guardians of peace. Protectors of sleep. Old Jorund, the leader of the watch, moved slowly as he prepared for his shift. His hair was streaked with gray, and his hands were thick with calluses, but his eyes still held the alertness of youth. He pulled on his bearskin cloak, tied his belt tight, and reached for the old iron lantern that had hung by his family's hearth for generations. Outside, the sky was a dome of silence. The wind whispered gently through the pine trees that bordered the village. Somewhere, a hound barked once, then settled. The cold was sharpening now, like the edge of a whetstone, but Jorund barely noticed. He had lived too many winters to mind the sting. Tonight, he would be joined by Leif, a younger man with quiet steps and thoughtful eyes. Leif had not yet seen war, but he had seen wolves circle the village from the tree-line, and once, the distant flicker of sails on the horizon that did not belong. He walked beside Jorund now, their boots crunching faintly on the frost-kissed earth. The village was small, no more than 30 homes. But it sat near a narrow inlet that gave passage to both trade and trouble. It was not uncommon for fishermen to tell of strange ships in the moonlight, and the memory of raids from years past still lingered in the minds of the old. The first watch would walk the southern edge, where the forest came nearest. The second would follow the shoreline, eyes scanning the cold expanse of water. The third, just before dawn, would check the fences and look in on the livestock, so precious in a land where every animal meant warmth, food, or milk. As Jorund and Leif passed each longhouse, they paused. They listened. They watched for embers escaping from chimneys, or any sign that someone might need help. These were quiet moments. Gentle ones. Not every night was dramatic. In fact, most were not. But in these quiet hours, the Viking soul found something deeper than glory. It found peace in duty. It found strength in stillness. A thin sliver of moon hung low over the fjord now, casting a path of silver across the water. Leif paused there, eyes drawn to it. "Do you think the gods watch us at night?" he asked softly. Jorund smiled faintly. "If they do, they'd see that we are watching, too." They reached the southern edge where the trees whispered in the dark. Jorund raised his lantern, the light flickering gently across the trunks of pines. All was still. The night air carried the scent of cold moss and distant salt. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. And still they stood. Not because they feared what was in the forest, but because they respected what might be. This was the Viking Night Watch. And this was only the beginning. The lantern's glow danced gently in Jorund's hand as he and Leif turned from the forest's edge and made their slow way back through the narrow footpaths of Fjord. The night deepened, and above them, the stars multiplied like scattered silver coins tossed across black velvet. There was no rush in their stride, there never was. This was a village that breathed with the rhythm of the earth. Life here moved slowly, like the pull of the tide or the drift of clouds over the mountain. They passed the home of old Thora, the midwife. Her hearth still glowed faintly through the wooden slats. Earlier that day, she had helped deliver a child, a small girl, born with a cry so loud it startled the chickens. Now all was quiet. No lamp in the window. Just stillness, and the scent of herbs. Leif paused to listen again, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his small axe. The leather strap around his shoulders creaked as he shifted his weight. His ears caught only the soft rustle of wind and the occasional crack of ice loosening on a roof. Jorund handed him the lantern. "Your turn," he said simply, and Leif accepted it with a quiet nod. They had walked this path many nights before, and each time it felt different. The seasons painted it anew. In spring, the earth was soft and fragrant. In summer, the air hummed with insects. Tonight, in the heart of winter, everything was held still, like the breath of the land itself had been paused. As they turned the bend toward the fjord, the wind shifted slightly, bringing with it a faint tang of seawater and fish nets. The boats were all pulled onto shore now, resting on wooden braces. Their curved prows rose toward the sky like sleeping beasts. The ice had begun to gather at the edges of the water, thin sheets that cracked under pressure and reformed moments later. Here, at the water's edge, they stood a while. A small stone fire pit sat nearby, ringed with smooth river rocks. They did not light it, there was no need, but its presence was comforting, as if those who watched before still lingered in its memory. Leif placed the lantern on one of the stones. Its light spread across the pebbled shore, casting long shadows behind the boats. "Did you ever sail far?" he asked, after a moment. Jorund folded his arms, thinking. "Far enough," he said. "To places where the air was warm and the bread tasted of strange grains. But always I returned." "Why?" The old man looked out across the black water, where the stars seemed to melt into the sea. "Because no place feels like this place. Even in the dark." The lantern's light flickered again, and the wind gave a gentle sigh through the masts of the boats. They creaked and groaned faintly, like sleeping old men telling stories in their dreams. They moved on, walking now toward the eastern slope where the cattle were penned. In the stillness, even the low moo of a cow seemed to echo far. The animals were calm, their bodies pressed together for warmth. One calf blinked drowsily at the light, then lowered its head again into the hay. "Anything missing?" Jorund asked softly. Leif shook his head. "All accounted for." "Good," the old man whispered. "Let's not wake them again." They continued along the fence line, inspecting the posts, the rope, and the stones packed at the corners to block burrowing foxes. It was all in order. This was the heart of the watch, not drama or danger, but small, careful observations. Listening. Smelling the wind. Knowing when something was out of place. Their last stop was the old wooden tower at the edge of the village. It was not tall, but it stood high enough to see the surrounding hills and the fjord mouth. It had been built long ago, before Jorund's time. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was blessed. Tonight, it was just silent. They climbed it slowly, each wooden step groaning softly beneath their weight. When they reached the top, Leif placed the lantern on the ledge. Its glow extended out like a beacon across the snowy roofs. From here, they could see everything. Smoke curling from chimneys. A pair of dogs curled near the blacksmith's door. The glint of ice along the fjord. And all of it under the soft hush of a Viking winter night. Jorund leaned against the railing. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Leif listened. "Nothing." "Exactly. That's the sound of a village at peace." The lantern flame flickered once more. The wind shifted again. Far off in the distance, a wolf howled, long and low. Neither of them stirred. It was far away. And they were here. Watching. Waiting. Guarding the sleep of those who trusted them. The night watch continued, slow and steady, as if following the rhythm of an ancient drum long buried beneath the earth. From the wooden tower, Leif and Jorund descended without a word. The steps creaked gently beneath their feet, but not loud enough to stir the sleeping crows perched above. At the base, Jorund paused to stretch his shoulders. His cloak shifted slightly, and a few flakes of frost fell from the fur. "We'll circle by the ship shed," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly, softened by the years. Leif nodded, lantern in hand, and together they moved along the trodden path leading toward the shed where the villagers kept ropes, oars, and sails, tools of the sea, waiting for warmer winds. The shed sat beneath a large pine tree, its boughs weighed down by snow. The beams creaked gently as wind passed through the loose boards. Even in sleep, the sea seemed to hum here. Leif stepped inside first, his lantern casting long shadows across coils of rope and polished wood. Everything was where it should be. The ropes, thick, twisted by hand from flax and animal sinew, hung in loops from iron nails. Their shadows moved like sleeping serpents in the lantern light. Leif reached out and brushed his fingers over one. It was smooth, cold, and faintly scented of salt. A few wooden shields leaned against the far wall, their paint faded from seasons of use. Not for battle now. Just for memories. Behind the shed, the path curved upward toward the Elders' Hall, a larger longhouse where meetings were held and decisions made. It was not the time for gatherings, but the watch passed by it anyway, as it stood high above the village, like a silent guardian of its own. The hall was quiet. Its doors closed. The fire inside had burned down to embers. But through the small smoke hole in the roof, a faint column of warmth rose into the sky, vanishing into the stars. They paused again there, on the slope, looking down at the village below. It was still, like a painting caught between breaths. The rooftops were silvered by frost, and a low fog curled between the houses. It gave the entire scene a dreamlike feeling, as if the village had slipped slightly into another world, just for the night. Leif sat down on a rock near the trail, resting the lantern beside him. Joran stood close by, leaning on his walking stick carved from driftwood, a gift from a trader long ago. "Why do you think it's so quiet tonight?" Leif asked, softly, as if even his voice might break the stillness. Joran gave a small shrug. "The sea sleeps. The forest breathes. And the gods are elsewhere." Leif tilted his head. "Do you believe in the gods still?" The old man chuckled gently. "Sometimes. When the wind speaks clearly. Or when the ravens circle too close. But mostly, I believe in keeping people safe." Leif watched the frost gather along the lantern glass. The flame inside flickered but did not go out. "You're not afraid?" he asked. "Of what?" "The dark. The cold. Being alone out here." Joran looked out across the horizon, where the fjord met the sky. "No. Because I'm not alone. You're here. The village is sleeping. And the stars remind me of how long we've been doing this." Leif was quiet then. He listened, not for danger, but for presence. And the night spoke softly in return. An icicle dropped from a branch. A bird shifted in its nest under the eaves. The faint crack of ice along the fjord, like a whisper from the deep. All these things were not signs of fear, but of life. Of nature moving slowly in the silence. Of the world continuing its gentle spin. Joran moved first, brushing frost from his boots, and began walking again. Leif followed, lifting the lantern and casting its circle of light ahead. They passed by the old granary, where sacks of barley and dried roots were stored beneath heavy beams. They checked the door, locked, secure, undisturbed. The granary smelled faintly of earth and hay and the last harvest of autumn. Inside, mice no doubt stirred in the haylofts, but none dared venture out now. Their final route would take them past the healer's hut, where birch bark was stacked beside jars of oils and wrapped roots. No smoke tonight. No need. The healer slept like the rest. As they walked, the air began to shift. Not colder, but quieter. As if even the wind had settled. The stars above seemed to drift slowly, guiding the night toward its last watch. And Joran, without looking, said softly, "Soon, the dawn will come." Leif nodded. And with it, their shift would end. But not yet. For now, the village still slept, and they still watched. Together. The hours between midnight and dawn move differently in a Viking village. Time stretches. Footsteps grow slower. The world becomes quieter than quiet, so hushed that even breath feels like a sound too loud. Jorund and Leif had now circled the village, the path beneath their boots packed firm from many such nights. The sky above was still clear, scattered with stars that shimmered like they were watching, too. There was no moon tonight, only the vast, ancient dark, dotted with light. Their boots crunched softly as they made their way past the weaver's cottage. Bundles of yarn hung under the eaves, dyed in earthy colors, deep browns, faded greens, soft ochres. During the day, women would sit on benches outside, their fingers dancing across looms, humming songs older than the stones beneath their feet. But now, the benches were empty, rimmed with frost, and the only hum was the faint sound of wine through the branches above. The weaver's dog stirred behind the door. Just one soft thump of its tail against the wooden floorboards. Leif smiled faintly. Even the dog is keeping watch. Jorun's voice was low and warm. He dreams he is. They moved past the smithy next, where the iron tools of the village rested. The forge, once alive with heat and hammering, stood cold and black. Anvils, axes, horse tack, all resting, waiting for the light to return. There was something comforting about these objects at night. Tools used by day to build, fix, mend, to protect. Now silent. Not threatening. Just sleeping. Like everything else. At the edge of the smithy's roof, an icicle had grown long, dripping with the melt of yesterday's faint sunlight. The lantern light caught it as they passed, making it shimmer gold for a moment. Then they turned, and it vanished back into the dark. Up ahead was a small rise, nothing grand, just a gentle hill that curved behind the village. From its crest, one could see the forest, the fjord, and the village all at once. Jorund stopped at the base of it and looked toward Leif. "You should take the top," he said. Leif hesitated. "Why me?" "Because it's your first winter watch. You should see the view." With a quiet nod, Leif stepped forward and climbed. His breath puffed white in the air. The grass underfoot was stiff with ice. And at the top, he stopped. He looked out across the land, and the breath caught slightly in his chest. The village lay below him, its roofs silvered, its chimneys smoking faintly. Beyond it, the fjord gleamed like a ribbon of glass, still and endless. The forest curved dark and deep, an ancient sea of trees guarding them on the inland side. Above all, the sky stretched wide, so clear it felt like you could fall into it. For a long moment, Leif stood there, not moving. Not thinking. Just being. Then he heard Jorun's voice, drifting up from below. "Well, it's beautiful," Leif said. "That's why we watch," came the reply. "Not just to guard the village. But to remember this." The wind brushed softly through Leif's hair as he stepped down from the rise. They moved on in silence for a while. Their path now took them behind the old storage hut, where dried fish were hung and barrels of mead were stored for the festivals. The smell of smoked herring still lingered faintly in the air, sharp, oily, familiar. A few deer prints were visible in the snow here, half filled with wind-blown powder. Leif knelt and touched one. "From today?" Jorund nodded. "A mother and her fawn. They come sometimes when the village sleeps. The dogs do not chase them, and we do not scare them. Do they know we mean no harm? Maybe. Or maybe they're just hungry." As they continued, Leif let the lantern hang low, its light trailing along the ground, making the frost sparkle like shattered stars. His fingers had gone a little numb, but he didn't mind. Not anymore. Jorun's voice came again, quieter now. "When I was your age, I watched with my uncle. We saw a falling star once. Bright as fire. It split the sky open. Did you make a wish? No. I just watched it fall. Some things don't need a meaning. They just are. The younger man nodded, the thought sitting with him like a warm coal in his chest. At last, they came full circle, returning to the path where their watch had begun. The lantern was dimmer now. The oil nearly gone. And in the east, just barely, the edge of the sky had begun to soften, from deep black to navy, to the faintest gray-blue. Dawn was still far. But it was coming. The coldest part of the night had passed. And the village was still safe. Still dreaming. Still whole. The last hour of the night was always the quietest. It was the hour when even the wind grew tired, when the cold stopped biting and simply settled. The stars above no longer glared but seemed to rest in place, fading slowly, giving way to the edge of a coming dawn. Jorund and Leif walked slowly now. Their steps had no urgency. The rhythm of the night was in their bones, and every stone beneath their feet felt familiar. No torches were lit in the village. No doors opened. The people slept on, unaware of the guardians who walked while they dreamed. Leif held the lantern low again, but its flame was faint now, just a soft glow at the center, flickering like a whisper. They passed by the goat pens. A soft bleat came from one corner. Perhaps one of the animals stirred in its sleep, sensing the faintest change in the air. Leif reached out, laid a hand gently on the fence, and paused. He looked toward Jorund. Do you ever feel the village breathing? Jorund raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Leif gestured to the air, the quiet, the stillness. Like, the whole place is alive. Not just the people. But the wood, the roofs, the trees. Like it all sleeps together. The old man considered this and nodded slowly. Yes. Some nights. When the sky is clear, and the fire burns steady, and the animals don't stir. That's when the village is deepest in its dreaming. And we're the only ones awake in it, Leif said. A strange honor, Jorund agreed. But a sacred one. They turned again toward the center of the village, where the carved post of the gods stood. It was not a grand temple. Just a single pillar of wood, weathered and simple. The faces of the old gods, Odin, Thor, Freyr, were carved into its surface, their features softened by wind and time. Beside it, a small bowl of ash sat. Someone had left an offering earlier in the day. Bits of dried fruit. A sliver of smoked meat. Leif paused here, lowering the lantern. Its fading light danced across the faces carved in wood. He whispered a few quiet words, nothing grand, just thanks. Thanks for safety. Thanks for another night without trouble. Thanks for the silence. Jorund stood back, giving the moment space. Then, as if in answer, a faint breeze passed through the trees behind them. It stirred the branches just once, as though someone had sighed. They continued onward. Past the dyer's hut, where racks of cloth hung limp in the dark. Past the low stone wall that marked the edge of the burial ground, where the village ancestors rested beneath small cairns. Jorund tipped his head slightly toward the stones. Some of them were watchmen, too, he said. Leif looked toward the graves. Do you think they still walk with us? I think they don't need to, Jorund replied. We do the job well enough. The younger man smiled faintly. They followed the path toward the rear gate of the village, a small wooden fence more symbolic than defensive. It faced the open field and the stream beyond. A thin blue light began to spread across the village, brushing the rooftops like soft fingers pulling back the edge of a dream. Dawn was not yet here, but it had announced its arrival with that pale, quiet glow that lives between night and day. Inside the longhouse, where the watchmen took their rest, the fire had burned low. Only a soft orange beneath the coals. Jorund and Leif stepped in quietly, the door creaking just enough to announce them but not enough to stir anyone already sleeping nearby. A few men stirred, those who would rise for the first morning watch. One of them, Eric, sat up and rubbed his beard, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He was broader than Jorund and younger, but his movements were slow and thoughtful, as if he, too, carried the rhythm of the night in his bones. "How was it?" Eric asked, his voice hushed. Jorund removed his cloak and laid it over a wooden bench. "Quiet," he said. "A good night." Leif handed the empty lantern to one of the younger watchmen. The flame had died over an hour ago, and the metal was cold to the touch. Outside, a rooster crowed, just once. Not a loud call, but a signal. The sky had changed. The shift had begun. In the longhouse, the warm scent of smoke and pine still lingered. Furs lay folded in corners, and wooden shields hung above the hearth, more decorative now than necessary. The room felt held, cradled by the thick logs and the heavy roof. Safe. Rooted. Jorund sat down slowly, stretching his knees. "I remember when I could take night watch and still hunt the next morning." Leif chuckled softly as he unstrapped his belt. "I don't think I'd hunt now even if you paid me." The older man nodded. "Good. Let the younger ones take that pride. You've done what was needed." Outside, Eric and the others were beginning to stir. They gathered their cloaks, checked their axes, and poured a small splash of warm broth into wooden cups from a pot that had simmered near the hearth overnight. Leif took a cup in his hands and sat beside Jorund, sipping in silence. The taste was simple, herbs and bone. But comforting. Like something known since childhood. The longhouse began to glow slightly as dawn crept in through the gaps in the boards. Shadows softened. The faces of the carved wooden beams, shaped like dragons and serpents, began to show again. Jorund leaned back against the wall. "There's an old saying. The last hour of the night is when the soul listens." Leif looked at him. "What does it listen for?" "Truth. Regret. Peace. Whatever it needs." The younger man nodded slowly. "What did yours hear tonight?" Jorund smiled faintly. "Quiet. Just quiet." Another voice called from the back of the hall. Gunvor, one of the village women, had risen early and brought in fresh loaves of bread, wrapped in cloth. She placed them on a wooden table near the door, giving a respectful nod to the men of the night watch. No words needed. Just recognition. They had kept the night safe. She would begin the day. Outside, the dogs had begun to move, tails wagging, sniffing at snow, their paws padding softly across the frozen paths. Children would soon wake. Fires would be stoked anew. Life would return in its familiar rhythm. But for now, in this narrow slice of stillness between dark and light, there was rest. Leif finished his broth and leaned his head back, eyes drifting toward the ceiling beams. His body was tired, but his mind was still floating through the memory of the stars, the frost, the fox, and the silence. Jorund closed his eyes. Not to sleep just yet, but to sink a little deeper into the calm that came after the work was done. The torches had not been lit. The bells had not rung. There had been no danger. Only the sound of their boots in snow. The flicker of a lantern. And the long, patient breath of a Viking village that had made it through another winter night. Safe. Unbroken. Together. By the time the sun truly rose, its light was golden and gentle, never harsh in this part of the world. It slid across the village roofs, illuminating frost that sparkled like crystal dust. Thin plumes of smoke now curled upward from each longhouse, slow and winding, blending into the blue above like paint on silk. Leif had slept only a little. He hadn't needed much. After the long, peaceful walk of the night, his body was calm and still. His thoughts had slowed to the rhythm of the lantern's flicker, and his spirit seemed to stretch quietly inside his chest, satisfied. In the longhouse, a low hum of life returned. Someone was sharpening a blade with slow, practiced strokes. Someone else split firewood just outside, the thud of the axe muffled by snow. Jorund remained quiet as he sat by the fire, sipping a fresh cup of warm milk thickened slightly with oats and honey. His old fingers traced the rim of the carved wooden cup. His eyes were distant, not lost, just remembering. Leif joined him at the hearth again. The fire now crackled cheerfully, fed by logs thick with sap. The scent of pine filled the room. Neither spoke for a while. There was no need. The morning after a successful night watch was like the silence after a good story. Nothing more had to be said. Across the room, a boy was feeding scraps to a small dog. The animal's tail thumped happily against the wood floor. A woman stood by the open door, pulling her shawl tighter as she watched the sky change color. Steam rose from the porridge pot. Everything moved in soft, sleepy patterns. "Did you always live here?" Leif finally asked, eyes fixed on the fire. Jorund's smile was slow. "Not always. I was born 2 valleys east. But I came here when I was 17. Walked over the ridge with just a satchel and my father's axe. Why? The river near our village dried. Our goats were dying. Fjord had water, fish, and walls. And I knew how to use my hands." Leif looked into the fire. "Did you miss your home?" "Every day, at first. Then less. Then only when I smelled birch smoke, or heard a certain bird call. Eventually, Fjord became home. My children were born here. My wife planted onions in this soil. Now, I know every stone in these paths." Leif nodded, taking in the thought slowly. Outside, a pair of ravens passed overhead, calling to one another. Their wings beat with purpose, dark shadows against the brightening sky. "Do you think you'll ever leave?" he asked. Jorund shook his head, gently. "I'll rest beneath the stones here. Beside the hill. Like my wife did. I've done enough wandering for one life." A soft knock came at the door. It opened gently, and in stepped another young man, Viggo, wrapped in a thick brown cloak. His cheeks were red from the cold, and a small leather pouch hung from his belt. "I brought more oil," he said, holding up the pouch. "For the lanterns." Leif stood and took it from him. "Thank you. We nearly burned through it last night." "No trouble," Viggo said with a grin. "The seals were generous this season." He lingered near the fire, warming his hands. Then he looked toward Jorund with a quiet respect. "Some say the gods favor us," he said softly. "That's why the nights stay quiet." Jorund looked at him carefully. "The gods may watch us," he said. "But it's the watchers who guard the doors." Viggo nodded, taking in the lesson. He left a moment later, his boots crunching back into the frost-covered trail. Leif sat again, the oil pouch resting beside him. He ran a hand across the wooden table, feeling the grain under his palm. "Do you remember your first night watch?" he asked. Jorund chuckled, a deep, warm sound. "Very well. I was paired with a man who barely spoke. He carried about taller than me and walked as if every twig might betray us. Did anything happen? A bear passed near the sheep pens. We froze in place and watched it move like a shadow. It didn't come close. Just sniffed the air and vanished." Leif imagined it, the breath of the bear in the frost, the tension in his limbs, the steady hand of his elder beside him. "There are worse ways to learn," he said. Jorund nodded. "And better ways to remember." The fire crackled again. The village now moved with the soft clatter of buckets being filled, ropes being hauled, children laughing in the distance. Life had returned, but the memory of the night still lingered in the wooden walls, in the grain of the benches, in the glow of coals. It would linger, quietly, until the next watch began. The day moved slowly in Fjord, as it often did in the deep of winter. The sun, though bright, hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that never quite warmed the earth. The snow on the rooftops remained untouched, unmelted. And the villagers moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from knowing time, weather, and the land. As the morning gave way to afternoon, and afternoon began to dim into early dusk, the warmth of the fires became more important again. The homes that had been open to the cold air during the day were closed tightly now. Wooden shutters drawn. Doors latched. Hearths fed with dry wood and pine cones, crackling with life. Jorund and Leif, having rested through the day, emerged from the longhouse not to patrol, but to feel the shift in the air. They stood by the edge of the goat pen, looking toward the horizon, where the sun kissed the tops of the trees for just a breath before slipping away. The light was golden again. Softer than before, thinner, like the final page of a long book. Always comes quicker than you think, Jorund said, his breath curling in front of him. Leif nodded. The quiet returns fast. Yes, the older man said. Like a blanket drawn over tired shoulders. As night returned to Silent Fjord, the familiar evening rituals began. Children were called inside. Chickens herded back to their coops. Tools tucked into corners and covered with cloth. You could hear the sound of wooden doors closing, soft thuds, one after another, like stones dropped into deep water. Smoke once again rose in long spirals. The village was settling. Preparing. Leif walked slowly through the center path. Not yet on duty. Not quite resting. Just moving like a part of the land. A gentle observer of the transformation. A woman was singing inside one of the longhouses, just a lullaby, barely audible. Something about a bird and a snow-covered hill. It was a song Leif hadn't heard since he was a boy. He paused, listening with closed eyes. Across the village, someone laughed. Softly. Then silence again. In the healer's hut, the flame of an oil lamp danced behind oiled linen windows. The scent of dried herbs drifted through the air, thyme, maybe, or sweet nettle. Preparations for a tea, perhaps, or a salve. Nothing urgent. Just the slow, deliberate care of a village tending to its own. Jorund joined Leif again, this time carrying a new lantern, freshly filled with seal oil, its wick trimmed, its glass polished. The flame inside was steady, golden, and quiet. "We'll walk again soon," he said, not as a command, but a reminder. A tradition. A returning. Leif took the lantern gently, holding it with both hands as if it were something alive. The warmth spread through the metal, reaching his palms. The light flickered slightly. The watch hadn't begun yet, but it would. And he was ready. They passed the carving post again, where the gods of old looked out over the village. Small offerings had been added since the morning. The sky had fully darkened now. A deep navy curtain hung over Silent Fjord, stitched with stars that shimmered like the edges of ancient silver coins. The moon was not full tonight, just a quiet crescent resting low in the east. But even in its modest form, it lit the snow with a soft blue glow. Leif and Jorund walked the southern edge of the village now, the lantern swinging gently in Leif's hand. Its flame glowed steadily inside the glass, casting round patches of warm gold on the snow as they moved. Every few steps, it flickered softly in the breeze, as if blinking sleepily. They walked not in haste but with rhythm, measured, familiar. Boots pressing down through the soft crust of snow. The occasional creak of a leather strap. The sigh of breath between them. Far below, where the fjord curved in a smooth inlet beneath the cliffs, the water gleamed like black glass. Ice had begun to crawl along the edges. Thin, silver-laced patterns stretching slowly outward like roots beneath a frozen pond. The surface remained still, broken only by the faint bob of a docked fishing boat and the distant ripple of a sea-bird landing gently. Jorund paused and pointed to the stars directly overhead. "There," he said. "That one, see it?" Leif followed his finger. "The hunter," he guessed. "No. Just above it. That one flickers more." They say it's because it's farther from the gods. Leif tilted his head. Or because it's nearer to us. Jorn smiled at that. Could be. The old stories are flexible. They breathe. The two men stood in silence again, eyes to the sky. Overhead, constellations told their own tales. A wolf chasing a hare. A dragon whose tail curled from east to west. And the great ship, formed by 4 bright stars, said to carry the souls of the bravest warriors across the sky, oars cutting through clouds like waves. In the distance, the sound of ice cracking reached their ears. A low, hollow pop, followed by silence. Not a threat, just the shifting of water beneath the cold. The fjord, stretching and settling. They moved again. Past the outer pens, past the cold barrels of fish sealed with waxed cloth and heavy lids. Past the racks of drying cod, their shadows long and skeletal under the flickering torch near the storage hut. Everything here was touched by both care and cold. The wooden railings had been rubbed smooth by decades of hands. The gates were bound with thick rope and iron hinges that creaked only slightly when moved. A world built to withstand wind, time, and memory. As they reached the southern watch marker, a post wrapped in braided animal sinew and a small iron bell, Leif stopped and listened. Not to the bell, but to everything else. The distant rush of water beneath the fjord's ice. The faint hiss of wind in the pine trees above. The dull hum of firelight behind shuttered windows. And somewhere deep in the forest, the hoot of an owl. Soft. Measured. Wise. The snow had hardened underfoot, forming a thin crust that crunched with each step. Leif and Jorund had resumed their rounds, the lantern swaying between them like a small sun suspended in time. Its glow rippled over the path, lighting patches of frost that shimmered like silver thread woven into the land. Frost had crept into every corner, along the wooden fences, over the wheel rims of a cart left beside the storage hut, and across the ropes tied to the docks. Even the stone hearths outside the longhouses wore a fine dusting of white, untouched by fire since sunset. The wind had changed too. No longer a steady breeze, but slow and thoughtful, moving gently between houses, slipping around corners like a quiet guest. It carried with it the scent of pine smoke and the barest hint of salt from the sea. Every now and then, Leif would glance up at the hills behind the village. Their peaks were outlined against the star-filled sky, the dark shapes of trees dotting the ridges like silent sentinels. Somewhere out there were the trails the hunters used in warmer months. But now those paths slept too, buried under snow, waiting. They reached the granary, a raised wooden structure supported by thick beams. Leif checked the latches and peered beneath it with the lantern. Just a pile of straw, dry and unbothered. All quiet, he murmured. Jorund grunted softly in agreement. Too quiet for mischief. He knelt beside a set of small tracks in the snow, just tiny paw prints, weaving in and out near the firewood stack. Fox, he said. Looking for mice. Nothing more. Leif leaned in, observing the trail as it curled around the corner. I wonder if he watches us the way we watch the village. Jorund smiled faintly. Maybe he does. Maybe he thinks we're the strange ones. As they moved on, the world felt softer. The village was no longer just asleep. It was deeply dreaming. The kind of sleep where nothing stirred. No shutters creaked. No footsteps followed. It was a time of stillness. A time when watchers walked alone with their thoughts. Leif's mind wandered. He thought of his father, who once walked these same rounds. He could still remember the way his father's voice would hum when he thought no one was listening. Just low tones, wordless, carried on the night wind. He tried to hum the same way now, softly under his breath. The notes were quiet, a lullaby meant only for the trees and stars. They passed the well, frozen now, its bucket sealed with ice. Around it, someone had placed a bundle of dried herbs, likely for luck. Juniper, tied with a thin leather cord. Leif stopped. Was this here earlier? Joran shook his head. New. They both looked around. No footprints, no sound, no sign of who left it. Just a quiet gesture left in the dark. Maybe someone made a wish, Leif said. Or gave thanks, Joran offered. For peace. It was strange, how even small things could feel sacred under the moonlight. Past the sleeping houses, beyond the last flickers of torchlight, the village met the sea. Leif and Joran stepped onto the cold stones of the shoreline, where the tide had long since receded and left behind a smooth sweep of frost-covered pebbles. The moon, now higher in the sky, cast silver reflections on the faint ripples still lapping at the edges. A soft hush followed the water's rhythm, just the gentle breath of the fjord. They paused. The frozen shore always had its own quiet. Not the hush of a sleeping home, nor the stillness of trees in winter. But a different silence, older, wider, filled with the memories of sails and storms, oaths and departures. This was where we said goodbye to Thorvald, Joran said quietly, glancing out toward the horizon. You remember? Leif nodded. I was just a boy. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me to look after my mother. Joran gave a slight smile. He knew you would. They walked slowly along the shoreline, their boots leaving shallow imprints in the thin crust of frost atop the sand. The boats were moored nearby, covered with tarps and pine boughs, their prows like sleeping beasts pointed out to sea. Some of them hadn't moved in months. Others had returned only days ago, their hulls still stained with brine and cold fish blood. Leif paused near a smaller boat, a rowboat with a single broken oar resting inside. My grandfather carved that one, he said. Joran raised an eyebrow. Still floats. Barely. But no one wants to burn it. Then let it rest. Above them, gulls nested silently along the cliff edge. By day, they filled the sky with their harsh cries and sharp wings. But at night, even they grew still, heads tucked, feathers fluffed, dreaming their strange dreams. Leif turned his eyes upward. The stars feel lower near the sea, he whispered. Like they want to reach the water. Joran followed his gaze. Or maybe the sea wants to rise and meet them. The idea was comforting. Two vast things, drawn together, sky and ocean, watching over those who lived between them. They reached the driftwood pile, a spot where villagers left logs and broken planks from old boats. It was half frozen now, pieces layered with snow. Among them, an old shield rested, its paint worn off, just faint rings of faded blue around the iron boss. Joran picked it up, brushed it off, and leaned it gently against the stones. It belonged to someone, he said. Someone who stood, once. Leif nodded and didn't speak. Some things were better left as gestures. A breeze rolled in from the water. Not harsh, just enough to lift the edges of their cloaks and bring with it the faint scent of salt and kelp. In the distance, across the fjord, the lights of another village shimmered like fallen stars. Distant, small, but there. Do you ever wonder if they're watching too? Leif asked. Them? Joran said. Of course. Same sky, same sea. Maybe even the same dreams. The wind had quieted by the time Leif and Joran returned to the heart of the village. It was the deepest part of night, those few hours before dawn when the stars shone the brightest and even the bravest dreams dared to wander farther. A chill hung over the rooftops like a soft blanket of breathless air. But inside, behind wooden walls and carved doorposts, the hearths of the village still pulsed with warmth. Leif paused near one longhouse where a faint plume of smoke rose through the chimney. They're burning birch bark tonight, he said. Joran nodded. Sweet smell. Means they've kept the coals alive. Keeping a hearth warm through the night was not just comfort, it was tradition. Even as everyone slept, the fire remained. Not roaring, but glowing softly, like a watchful guardian at the feet of slumbering kin. In the silence, you could almost hear them, the creaks of beds as sleepers turned, the quiet clink of iron pots settling into the embers, the slow rhythm of breath and dreams. They passed an open window with thick wool stretched across it for insulation. From inside came a low, muffled voice. Someone praying in their sleep, or murmuring the edge of a dream they didn't want to forget. Leif smiled. My grandmother used to speak to her ancestors while she slept. Said it was the only time they listened. Or maybe it's the only time we do, Joran said thoughtfully. They stopped before the home of the village blacksmith. Even from outside, they could see the glow from within, dim, but present. The man was likely asleep now, but his forge never cooled completely. A sacred flame, as important as any torch on the watch path. Inside that home, iron tools rested near the hearth, hammers, tongs, half-formed blades. Each one marked by the day's sweat and the heat of the flame. The blacksmith's work never truly ended, it simply slept, the way the village did. Further on, near the center of the village, stood the communal hall, a place for gatherings, meals, and council. It was locked and empty now, but the memory of fire lingered there too. The great hearth at its center, ringed by stones carved with runes of protection and warmth, had been the heart of many nights. Joran traced a rune on the doorframe with his glove. Do you think the fire spirits sleep? He asked. Leif tilted his head. Maybe they rest, but never all the way. There's always a spark. That spark lived in more than wood and flame. It lived in memory. In the stories told over smoke. In the quiet courage of those who stood watch while others dreamed. In the gentle way firelight flickered across the eyes of someone remembering a name long gone. They turned down a narrow path between two homes. The snow here was undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks. Only the soft glimmer of frost on each wooden board and log. As they walked, Leif could feel the village breathing again. Not with sound, but with presence. Snow had begun to fall again, light as ash, silent as breath. Tiny flakes drifted gently from the heavens, layering rooftops, stones, and paths with a fresh veil. The night absorbed the snowfall without protest, as though it had been waiting for this soft cover all along. Leif and Joran moved slowly now. Their boots crunched lightly, barely disturbing the fragile hush that had settled over the village. Every surface glowed faintly under the moonlight, muted silver tones softening the sharpness of rooftops and fences. They came upon the carver's shed. It sat near the edge of the village, tucked against the slope where pine trees leaned like watchers over the homes. The shed was small, with thick beams and an overhanging roof. Its doorway was narrow, and the windows shuttered tight, but snow had crept into every crack along the frame. Joran wiped the frost from a wooden plank leaning outside. A dragon's head stared back at him, half-finished, its eyes bold even beneath the frost. Egil's work, he murmured. I remember when he started this. Said he'd carve it for the prow of his son's boat. Leif brushed his hand over the surface. He never finished it. No, Joran said. But still, it waits. Inside the shed, they could see other figures, shapes lost in shadow, birds with stretched wings, wolves with fierce jaws, coils of serpents winding into each other. Each one silent now. Resting in wood. Waiting for spring. Waiting for fire and story. Leif turned toward the hill behind the shed. Come, he said. They climbed the slow slope together, each step muffled by snow. The trees creaked lightly above them, their branches holding the weight of the world in frozen silence. At the top of the hill stood an old stone. Carved with runes, smoothed by wind and time, it marked the oldest point in the village, the spot where the first longhouse had once stood, and where the ancestors were said to have made their first oaths. The runes were faded but still legible to those who knew how to read the old tongue. Joran placed his gloved hand on the surface. It says, "We belong to the fire and the sea. To the storm and the stillness." Leif whispered the words with him, his breath visible in the night air. Around the stone, smaller carvings had been made, names etched by families across generations, some barely readable, some deep and sharp as though newly done. There were spirals, suns, axes, and handprints. Signs of memory. Marks of belonging. Snow covered much of it now. But beneath that blanket, the stories remained. They sat near the stone for a time, watching the flakes gather around their feet. Leif traced a spiral carved into a rock beside him. "My father carved this after I was born," he said quietly. Jorund looked over, his eyes soft. "I remember that night. The whole village lit torches. Your mother sang to the fire." Leif smiled. "She always said I was born on a night like this. Silent, silver, and full of falling snow." As the snow continued its silent descent, Leif and Jorund made their way to the great longhouse at the village's center. It stood taller than the others, a wide timbered hall with thick walls, deeply pitched roof, and beams darkened by generations of smoke. The longhouse wasn't just a place, it was memory itself. A chamber where the past lived and breathed among the living. Where fires had burned for 100 winters, and songs had risen into the rafters like birds at dawn. Tonight, the doors were shut, but a faint orange glow seeped through the cracks in the planks. Leif gently pushed the heavy door inward. It opened with a low creak. Inside, the air was warm and full of quiet light. A central hearth smoldered, logs collapsed into embers, their heat still radiating across the room. Shadows of old banners danced along the beams above. Along the wooden walls were benches, carved chests, and thick woolen cloaks hung on pegs. Horns for drinking and shields for war sat side by side, as if sharing in the same long rest. Jorund stepped inside and breathed deeply. "Still smells of pine wood and roasted meat," he said. "And stories," Leif added. Indeed, the longhouse was a place where voices had layered themselves, one over another, season after season. Whispers of laughter, counsel, mourning, celebration. They clung to the corners of the room like cobwebs spun from memory. Leif walked past the hearth and stopped at a carved post, running his fingers along the notches. "My grandfather carved one for every storm that passed without a roof beam falling," he said. "That must be hundreds," Jorund said. Leif nodded. He believed the wood could hold memory. That each scar was a protection. They moved further inside. Jorund paused near the storyteller's seat, a wide, low stool near the fire, smoothed over time by countless evenings of use. Behind it, the wall bore carvings of ships, wolves, and great birds. Symbols of past tales. "Do you remember the first story you heard here?" Jorund asked. Leif smiled faintly. "My uncle told of a fisherman who caught the wind in a net and traded it to the gods." Jorund laughed softly, his voice barely above the crackling embers. "I remember that one. And the tale of the 3 sisters who sowed the northern lights from their mother's tears." Silence settled again, not heavy, but familiar, like an old friend who asks for nothing but your presence. They sat beside the hearth for a time. No words. Just the sound of glowing wood, and the occasional creak of the beams above, aged wood shifting softly in the warmth. The longhouse watched them, as it had watched many others before. 2 night guards, wrapped in cloaks, pausing within its shelter as the village slept all around them. Jorund reached for the fire poker and stirred the embers gently. Sparks lifted briefly before fading, casting small bursts of gold across the room. The fire is still strong. Outside the longhouse, the snow had deepened. It gathered on fence rails, settled over cart wheels, and tucked itself into every hollow of the earth. Each step Leif and Jorund took now left a crisp imprint, softening almost as soon as it was made. But despite the hush of the world around them, the time had come for the next round of the watch. They walked slowly toward the far side of the village, the eastern edge, where the final watch fire burned in a stone ring surrounded by driftwood benches. This fire was special. It didn't sit near homes or paths. It stood alone, facing the forest beyond, as if guarding the unknown. The wind had grown colder. Not fierce, but sharp enough to sting the cheeks. The kind of cold that didn't shout, but whispered, reminding you of your place in the vastness of winter. As they approached, the fire appeared through the swirling flakes. It was smaller now, its flame dipping low, but still alive. Its coals glowed a soft orange, like the last breath of a song hummed at dusk. Leif crouched beside it, adding a dry log from the nearby stack. He stirred the base gently with a stick, uncovering red embers hidden beneath the ash. They sparked and caught, and the flame rose slowly in gratitude. "There," he said. "It remembers." Joran stood nearby, gazing into the dark forest. The trees were tall and unmoving, their trunks striped with snow, their branches heavy with stillness. "I used to fear the woods at night," he admitted. "As a boy, I thought there were spirits that whispered between the trees." Leif looked up at him. "Maybe there are," he said softly. "But not all spirits are meant to be feared." Joran smiled at that, his breath visible in the air. "I like that." They both sat now, shoulder to shoulder, their cloaks drawn close around them. The fire crackled gently. No one else was awake. No one else would come. This hour belonged to the quiet. To the watchers and the waiting. Beyond the village, the land stretched outward into black and silver, a world erased of color but rich in texture and shadow. Somewhere, far off, an owl called once, then fell silent. Leif leaned back slightly. "This is my favorite fire," he said. "Why?" Joran asked. "Because it watches what no one else sees. It faces the forest, the night, the unknown. It burns not to warm the homes, but to mark the edge of what is ours." Joran nodded. "I used to sit here with my sister," he said after a moment. "When she was small, she'd fall asleep on my shoulder before the fire even settled." Leif didn't answer with words, only a glance, and the fire continued its soft murmur. A single flake landed on Joran's glove. He watched it melt. Everything around them felt eternal, held in a moment that did not ask to be remembered, only lived. And in that quiet, even the trees seemed to listen. Even the stars above seemed to breathe. Eventually, Leif stood. "One last check of the paths," he said. Joran nodded, rising too. With the eastern fire left behind, Leif and Joran turned toward the last stretch of their watch. This path curved behind the village and along the edge of the frozen stream, where a thin sheet of ice glimmered faintly in the moonlight. The trees here grew closer together. Tall pines leaned overhead like silent sentinels, their needles heavy with snow. The only sound was the soft crunch of boots on frozen earth and the occasional whisper of the wind threading through the branches above. The moon had climbed higher now. It cast pale light over the path, turning the snow into a silver-blue ribbon winding through the darkness. Their shadows moved with them, two long shapes, stretching and shrinking as they passed between trees. "This path always feels different," Joran murmured. "Like we're walking between worlds." Leif nodded slowly. "The village to our left, the wild to our right." They walked for a time in silence, following the curve of the land. To their left, the outlines of distant rooftops could still be seen, dark shapes softened by snow. To their right, the forest deepened, with no torchlight to reach into its heart. They passed by the old boundary stone, a squat boulder half buried in snow, marked long ago with runes faded by time. Leif ran a gloved hand over the surface. "I don't know what it says," he admitted. "My uncle told me once," Joran replied. "He said it reads, 'Here the land begins again.'" Leif smiled faintly. "That sounds like something a rune would say." They moved on. Here, the cold seemed sharper. It pinched at their cheeks and whispered against their ears. But neither complained. The night had grown stiller, and every sound, Every shift of the trees, every crunch of snow, felt like a part of a larger rhythm. A song made for those who listened closely. Far ahead, a shape stirred in the snow. Both men paused. But it was no danger. Only a red fox, its fur thick and bright against the white. It turned its head, blinked once, and vanished into the trees like a dream dissolving in morning light. They watched the place it had gone, then resumed their pace. As they neared the stream, the ice reflected the moon with delicate precision. A single branch rested atop the surface, and beneath the glassy layer, tiny bubbles floated, suspended as if holding breath. Leif crouched for a moment, looking at the ice. "It never fully freezes," he said. "Even in the deepest cold." Jorund looked down as well. "Because there's always something moving underneath. Always something alive." They stood together by the edge of the stream. Listening. Watching. Thinking. Then, as all watchmen do, they moved on. Past the stream, the path rose slightly, leading them back toward the southern gate, their starting point. The loop was nearly complete. Behind them, the woods stretched into shadow. Ahead, the village slumbered. And above them, the stars kept their ancient vigil. The two men didn't speak now. There was nothing left to say. The wooden gate creaked gently as Leif pushed it open. Its iron hinges, cold and worn, gave just enough resistance to remind them of their weight. Once inside the village again, the cold seemed a little softer. The wind no longer pressed so sharply against their backs. The village had not changed in their absence. It still slept. Smoke no longer rose from the chimneys, but the faint scent of pine ash hung in the air. It mixed with the snow and the hush, as if the dreams of the village drifted between the rooftops and eaves. Leif and Jorund walked slowly through the snow-covered lane, their shadows stretching long behind them under the glow of the last torches. The night had passed with no danger, no signs of trouble. Just silence, and stars, and the quiet breath of the land in winter. As they neared the longhouse, the door stood waiting, half covered in frost, with the familiar wolf's head carving above it watching like an old guardian. Leif reached for the iron latch and pulled the heavy wood inward. Warmth greeted them. Not heat, exactly, but a remembered warmth, like the echo of a song or the scent of home. The hearth was still glowing. Not a fire, but a bed of embers, pulsing red beneath a thick quilt of ash. Inside, the longhouse was dark and still. Furs hung along the walls. Shields rested in their places. A low hum of breath filled the space, as the others slept beneath woolen covers and animal hides. No one stirred at their entrance. The world inside the hall remained unbroken. They stepped quietly across the wooden floor, their boots brushing against stray pieces of straw and the soft creak of old boards. In a far corner, near the embers, their bedrolls waited. Simple, fur-lined, folded neatly beside one another. Jorund removed his cloak, shaking off the snow gently so it wouldn't fall onto the warm furs. Leif did the same, then placed a few more pieces of wood gently onto the hearth. Not enough to build a fire, but enough to keep the heart of the flame alive until morning. They didn't speak. There was no need. The ritual was complete. The village was safe. The watch was over. Leif sank into his bedding, pulling the soft wool cover over his shoulders. Jorund followed, shifting slightly to find a comfortable position. The warmth of the hall settled around them like a second skin. For a few minutes, neither man moved. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Lightly. Gently. A world wrapped in white and silence. The wind softened. The forest rested. And within the longhouse, two men let their eyes close. Let the quiet in. Let the sleep come. The hours after returning from watch are unlike any other. In the stillness between night and dawn, time becomes thick, as if even the air is slower to move. Leif lay on his side, one arm curled beneath the blanket, eyes half closed but mind still drifting. Not awake. Not yet asleep. A single ember in the hearth pulsed softly, dim orange against the shadows. It was the only movement in the room. All around, the breathing of others could be heard, the slow, deep rhythms of rest. The occasional murmur. A gentle shift. The creak of a beam as the longhouse settled under the weight of snow on its roof. Leif let the silence surround him. He didn't think of danger now. The woods were quiet. The skies were clear. The sea, beyond the ridge, held no ships tonight. All was well. But there was a different kind of weight he always felt after the watch, a quiet heaviness in his chest that wasn't fear. It was memory. The long, dark hours spent walking. The creak of frozen wood. The flash of fox eyes in the dark. It wasn't sorrow. Just stillness. Across the fire pit, Joran stirred slightly, but didn't wake. He'd already surrendered to sleep. His face was calm, half buried in a fur blanket, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. Leif closed his eyes fully now. And the images came, not harsh like dreams, but gentle like the last thoughts before fading away. He saw the torchlight on the stone wall. The shimmer of frost on the goat pen. The moon above the southern hill. And the old runed stone, whispering, "Here the land begins again." There was something comforting in this repetition. Night after night, the same walk. The same steps. The same silences. It wasn't routine. It was ritual. It wasn't burden. It was belonging. Being part of something bigger than the self. Bigger than the village. Bigger than the forest or sea. A thread in a tapestry of countless other nights, other watchmen, other winters. All watching. All listening. All holding the night until dawn. Outside, snow fell more slowly now, each flake a tiny promise of morning. Inside, the embers whispered. The breath of sleep deepened. And Leif let go. Not with a word. Not with a thought. Just the soft weight of silence, pressing over him like a warm fur. And he dreamed of firelight on snow. Leif floated in a space that was neither night nor morning. Somewhere between firelight and snow. A realm of quiet breath, where time did not move forward, but drifted like smoke above a hearth. He dreamed. But the dream was soft, slow, and peaceful, more memory than imagination. He was walking again, along the frozen stream. Only this time, his boots made no sound. The forest around him shimmered, not with frost, but with the gentle glow of torchlight that seemed to hang in the air like golden mist. The trees breathed. The snow sparkled. And the stars above blinked slowly, as if in conversation. He saw Joran beside him, younger somehow, but just as calm. Their footsteps matched perfectly. No words were spoken, yet everything was understood. In the dream, the village was a glowing shape behind them. Each roof gently illuminated. Each chimney like a guardian tower. The people inside, mother, brother, friend, were symbols of warmth and home, tucked into the safety of sleep. Leif passed the boundary stone again. Its runes shone bright, their meaning now clear. You are part of this night. That was the message. Not a warning. Not a command. Just a reminder. The dream led him to the sea cliff now. The waves below didn't roar or crash. They hummed. A low, rhythmic sound like a lullaby from the earth itself. And there, on the edge of the cliff, stood a figure. Not cloaked. Not armed. Just still. Watching the horizon. As Leif approached, he felt no fear. Only recognition. It was one of the old ones. A night watchman from years past, wrapped in a fur cloak, face lined with years, eyes reflecting fire and snow and time. The man turned to him and smiled. Then placed a hand gently on Leif's shoulder. And for a moment, everything was quiet. Absolutely quiet. As if the whole world paused to breathe with him. No fear. No cold. No worry. Just the truth of being present. Of having walked the path. Of having held the night. Then the dream softened. The sea faded into snow. The snow melted into torchlight. And the torchlight slipped into the glow of early dawn. Light touched the edges of the longhouse like a whisper. It came slowly, first as a pale hue behind the wooden shutters, then a subtle change in the air. The darkness had not vanished, but it had thinned. A soft silver began to bleed through the slats of the timber walls, and with it came the hum of a world waking. Leif stirred. He didn't open his eyes right away. He simply noticed that the cold had softened. That the weight of the night had lifted. That the world, in its quiet way, had turned once more. The ember bed in the hearth was nearly cold now, a patch of gray and faint red among the ash. Outside, the snow had stilled. No wind. No noise. Only the soft presence of morning beginning its slow walk across the land. Joran shifted beside him, sighing as he stretched beneath the firs. Still no words. Still no rush. This was a sacred part of their lives, the in-between space. Not night. Not day. A pause in the turning of time. And in that pause, there was peace. Leif sat up slowly. The woolen blanket fell from his shoulders and the cold kissed his skin. He reached for the thick tunic folded nearby, draped it over his head, and fastened the leather belt quietly. His breath formed a mist in the dim air, but it no longer felt biting. Jorund was awake now too, sitting silently across from him. Their eyes met for just a moment. A simple glance. Acknowledgement. We did our part. From the storage shelf, Leif took the small clay pot of dried oats and poured a little into the blackened kettle. A ladle of snow was added, and the kettle hung low over the hearth. Not for hunger, but because the act itself was grounding. Ritual. A morning echo to the night's watch. Outside, a raven called once, its voice sharp but not urgent. Other birds would follow soon. And with them, people would stir. Children would cry out from beneath blankets. A father would stoke a new fire. Somewhere, a goat would bleat impatiently for feed. And a mother's hands would begin kneading bread before the full light of day found the doorway. Life would return to the village, as it always did. And Leif would blend back into it, not as a hero, not as a guardian. Just as one of many who stood watch. One of many who gave their night to the silence. One of many who helped hold the world while it slept. As the sky beyond the longhouse turned from silver to soft blue, Leif took a deep breath. The kind that fills not just the lungs, but the soul. He stood and walked to the doorway. Pushed it open. And looked out. The village roofs were blanketed in snow. The path he had walked the night before was still there, his footprints half gone now, covered by fresh flakes. And on the far horizon, the first true light of day emerged. A quiet promise. A new beginning. The watch was over. But the memory of it would remain, like a slow-burning fire, always warm beneath the ash.